Fear is a pretty universal experience, so it's no shock that writers use it constantly to explore characters. And while some of the most iconic characters in media are cowards, it's not always easy to do it well. Welcome to a running series called Exploring Frieren. My name is Pei, and today we're exploring the archetype of a coward. Character arcs are a fundamental part of storytelling, and fear has been used across all forms of media. Look at horror as a genre, or how often villains are terrifying. Generally, heroes face things without hesitation. But what happens when you place a coward among these heroes as a supporting character? It can contextualize everything and through contrast highlight the brave actions around them. Or, and this tends to be true too, it can be really annoying. So today we're going to be looking at primarily 3 different characters in anime that fall under this archetype of the coward. Stark from Frieren, Usopp from One Piece, and Zenitsu from Demon Slayer. This video was originally created with the intention of comparing Stark and Zenitsu, but in writing the video I realized that Usopp is an interesting sequitur between the two. That being said, a couple asterisks, we're going to be talking just about the anime adaptations of Frieren and Demon Slayer. We're not going to be talking about the manga. And for Usopp, we're primarily going to be focusing on the first couple arcs through Arlong Park. I haven't watched past the first 150 episodes of One Piece, so I probably shouldn't talk about Usopp as a general character rather than his introduction. Okay, qualifiers out of the way. Let's jump in. One of the best things you can do when creating a relatable character who's a coward is give them fears that are reasonable. Stories often take place in extreme circumstance, with lives and the world on the line. Zenitsu and Stark are facing terrifying monsters, and Usopp is essentially surrounded by gods capable of destroying buildings with single swipes. These characters being afraid makes sense, and while this helps, it doesn't mean that they're well-written characters. I'm specifically talking about Zenitsu here. I'll explain my criticism in more detail as the video goes on, but I've constantly seen people defending Zenitsu's poor character writing under the realm of realism. And while I do believe at first that Zenitsu's fears are reasonable, I argue that he's a poor example of the coward archetype that could have been so much more. There's this really cool clip from an interview with Gabe Newell, the famous game developer responsible for the Half-Life series. He argues fun is not realism but reinforcement.
Somebody say that's not realistic, and you're like, okay, explain to me why that's interesting, because in the real world, I have to write up lists of stuff I have to go to the grocery store to buy. And I've never thought to myself that realism is fun. I go play games to have fun. And so we had to come up with some notion of what fun was. We knew it was an ad hoc definition, and it was the degrees to which the game recognizes and responded to the player's choices and actions.
I agree a lot with parts of this sentiment. Media is made with a purpose in mind, and the pursuit of realism can get in the way of that goal. I'd also argue that realism can serve the purpose. It mostly depends on how it's done. While Gabe Newell was talking about video games, today we're talking about shows, and more specifically, characters in shows. While Zenitsu's fear could positively impact the character writing, in the end it just ends up getting in the way, and I don't feel that way about Stark or Usopp. So let's look at a couple reasons why this archetype of the coward doesn't work as well in Demon Slayer as the other 2 shows. Starting first with facing fear. A quick reminder, if you enjoy these videos or find yourself back here after watching a previous one, consider subscribing. Adversity and conflict is the basis of a lot of storytelling. Characters struggling and facing challenges are central to character growth. So when characters face their fear, it can be incredibly endearing. And the first difference between a well and poorly written coward is the way they explore the impacts of fear, not the fear itself. Being afraid is one thing, but the way the character responds ultimately determines how the audience is going to perceive them. Both Stark and Usopp face their fears despite them. Zenitsu is never proactive, often cornered before he takes any sort of response. There's one exception to that, but we'll get to that later. Usopp and Stark's heroism is expanded on, not diminished because of their fear. They're acting against their overwhelming instinct because they need to help or contribute. Zenitsu's big badass moments never seem to contribute to any confidence, but they also don't seem to come with any consequence. There's one moment where Zenitsu acts heroically without that crutch of being unconscious. In Season 1, Episode 12, Zenitsu faces his fear, protecting Tanjiro's box because he's his friend and it's important to Tanjiro. We'll talk about how important this scene is for my argument later when we come back to growth. But outside of that scene, Zenitsu consistently avoids facing his fears, which is especially frustrating given how powerful he is. Which leads to the next point, power. If you were to create a Venn diagram between Stark, Zenitsu, and Usopp, at the center would be the fact that they're cowards. But Zenitsu and Stark share another trait. They're incredibly powerful in universe. And in both cases, this leads to really cool moments where they get to show up against a powerful opponent. And while being strong isn't inherently a bad thing, Usopp's lack of power is part of what makes his character so interesting. He finds ways to contribute in this grand adventure, despite not having as powerful of a skill set as his surrounding allies. So while Usopp gets his shiny moments, it's never coming from a place of power, but ingenuity. But big shiny moments from power are incredibly fun. That's why a lot of other characters in One Piece get them so often. Zenitsu's power in Demon Slayer is incredibly frustrating. Not only because he should be continuously building confidence through the series as he fights stronger and stronger opponents, but also because I think the solution to his fear and how he consistently fights feels like a huge cop-out, especially with the way it's explored. Which leads to our third point, solution and consequence. For a character to be incredibly powerful and a huge coward, there needs to be some sort of circumstance and acknowledgement. Because someone who's incredibly powerful shouldn't stay afraid of things for very long. Alright, this is the point where we're going to start really getting into spoilers for both Frieren and Demon Slayer. We're going to be covering the first season of Frieren and Demon Slayer through the Hashira training arc. Something that makes Usopp and Stark really interesting characters is not only are their fears justified, but they adjust as the story goes on. Their fears are based off of the experiences they continue to have. When Stark finally overcomes the dragon, he doesn't simply just transform into someone that's no longer afraid, he just gains some level of confidence. And later, his reluctance to fight the demons doesn't undermine that growth, because when push comes to shove, he doesn't hesitate. We're getting a little bit too much into the growth category, which I want to talk about later, so instead we're going to focus right now on how Zenitsu's character doesn't have proper solutions and consequences. Having unconsciousness be the solution to Zenitsu's fear is a bit of an anime answer. That being said, most audiences, me included, constantly deal with weird answers and solutions to problems as long as they're properly set up. So my issue doesn't actually lie in the fact that Zenitsu's solution is that he's unconscious. It just feels like there should be some consequence or play around that idea. If power in stories is a byproduct of some shortcut, it needs to come with some trade-off. If Zenitsu can't overcome his fear and has to rely on his unconsciousness to fight, there should be trade-offs. There's a video from a YouTuber named Captain Mac that goes into potential answers to this feeling. For example, paraphrasing Captain Mac, if Zenitsu when he was unconscious wasn't capable of differentiating between ally and foe, that would create a consequence for that Deus Ex Machina. It would feel less like a cop-out. Or if Zenitsu had some sort of internal struggle where he was desperate to fight but couldn't get himself to pass out, that could have been a great moment for character growth where Zenitsu would learn that he couldn't rely on passing out to face his fears. There was also little to no explanation why Zenitsu could pass out and still fight, or why he became more conscious throughout the series while in that passed out state. There's a difference between implying things and a story requiring headcanon for anything to make sense. They could have just had a training arc where Zenitsu realized by closing his eyes and only listening, because that's his whole thing, he has great hearing, that he's capable of fighting without facing his fears. Literally any answer and consequence would be better than none. Stark's powerful but lacks self-confidence. As he takes on more enemies, he gains confidence and starts to lose that fear. In one season, we see more character growth from Stark than I feel like Zenitsu has gone through in the entire series so far. But even if we did see sudden change in Zenitsu, I think it would be incredibly undeserved because they'd have to explain the entirety of why he changed suddenly in the new season. No matter how justified the answer is, they're going to be introducing these ideas after he's already made some sort of change. Maybe it'll be done really well and they'll explore Zenitsu in a satisfying way by the end of the story. But more than likely, I won't be satisfied with any change that didn't feel set up over a long period of time, because while human growth comes in tipping points, that requires lots of buildup. Which leads to the fifth point, just walk away. I don't understand why Zenitsu is still a demon slayer if he's so afraid and not growing at all. Usopp is desperate to become a hero who goes on adventures and wants to overcome his fear. Stark keeps finding himself in situations where he can't leave people behind and needs to protect them. But why is Zenitsu still a demon slayer? If he's that afraid, just step away or find other ways to help. And if he can't do that, explain why he can't do that. If Zenitsu's fear is as serious as it seems to be, it should be explored in the story. Because facing your fears is actually a very admirable trait. Sticking to something that's really hard, despite your inclination not to, just to help people is actually very likable. And part of the reason I know that is because I love Usopp and Stark for those reasons. It's almost a more pure representation of heroism. In thinking about this, I don't even actually want Zenitsu to have quit being a demon slayer. I just wish the story had had given us more of a reason why he stuck with it, which leads to the last and I think most important part of this all, which is character growth. Even in the small chunk of One Piece I got to see, I felt like Usopp went through a lot of growth, and very importantly, not at a pace that felt unrealistic. It wasn't sudden and drastic. Big moments where he was brave were built up to, stakes were set. And along that line, Stark is an outstanding character that faces his fears consistently. He doesn't magically change overnight. He practices to counteract his fear and learns to trust those around him. He struggles to take those leaps of faith that are necessary to face your fears until people are in danger and he feels obligated to try to help. Stark and Usopp's growth often comes from proactive action, and they're so far from static characters. The closest thing we see to Zenitsu growing in the story is when he fights to save Tanjiro's box. Captain Mac's video points this out. It's a terrible sign when the scene that indicated the most growth in a character was in the first season and then they abandoned it completely. One of my friends a little while back retweeted this thing. It was a question asking what the best character design and worst executed character was. And to no shock, he retweeted Zenitsu. Part of the reason why I found this character so disappointing is because it felt like it had so much promise. I didn't realize I was a sucker for these archetypal cowards that are forced to face their fears. I enjoy Usopp and I love Stark. They navigate their fears in a way that's so compelling, especially given the fact that they're supporting characters that are sometimes overshadowed. Stark has so many magnificent moments, like facing the dragon for the first time, or when he faces the demon that can emulate his master's technique. He was so afraid of Aizen, so to see someone literally emulating that and then to overcome it, to realize that she just doesn't hit as hard, it's such a fantastic scene. The archetype of the coward has been emulated time and time again and resulted in some of the best moments in television. It's hard to do consistently well, but when a writer does a good job, it's just so easy for me to love those characters. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next week.